So I was definitely excited to read what would be my second book from Korean author Jeong You-Jeong. Now, I'd picked up her first book, The Good Son, actually in South Korea while I was there with my daughter some years ago, but back in the West, it was gaining some notoriety in press, not the least of which because of its sort of buzzy thriller plot, but also for the fact it was shortlisted for the inaugural Jimmy Fallon's Tonight Show Book Club. Now, it did eventually lose out to Tony Oyeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone, but I'm sure the mention of it raised it in its profile here in the West. And so I was excited to get my hands on her 2020 translation, 7 Years of Darkness, and as the name implies, the story is pretty darn dark. At 11 years of age, Choi So-won finds himself leaving Suncheon Police Station, having survived what would become known as the Suryong Lake disaster. His father would be arrested and charged with the murder of an 11-year-old girl, her father, accused of throwing his own wife, So-won's mother, into the river, opening the floodgates of the dam above Suryong village, wiping out half the town, and subsequently killing 4 policemen. And so, while Hansu languishes in jail, awaiting his execution, So-won ends up being pinballing from family member to family member, never lasting too long in one place, no one really wanting to take care of this dead-eyed son of a murderer. And even if he did manage to settle somewhere, invariably, copies of the magazine profiling that night and his father's role in that disastrous evening would appear at classmates' desks. Copies would get mailed to the landlord or his place of work, and those quiet whispers would turn into angry shouts, and So-won would find himself yet again packing up his things and moving. Having exhausted all avenues with his family, he turns to his only ally left in the entire world, someone who was with him the night of the Suryong Lake disaster, Mr. An. Until Mr. An disappears, leaving behind only a manuscript. It is a story that he's been working on for the past few years, and it seems to recount the events that led up to that disastrous evening. So So-won, age 18, 7 years after the climactic events of that evening, finds himself poring through the manuscript and learning a little bit more about the events that led up to it and this broken community. He reads about Suryong, the 11-year-old girl that Mr. An first discovers, cowering in the corner with a broken nose, cuts across her body, her clothes torn, clearly the victim of some horrible abuse, likely at the hands of her father, Dr. Oh, this cold and imperious but insanely wealthy dentist that's in the midst of a contentious divorce. So-won's father, Hyun-soo, a failed baseball star, now drinking heavily, forced to relocate to Suryong village to pay off a massive mortgage, always arguing with So-won's mother, and just never quite fitting in, and then slowly how it all begins to unravel from there. And that's all I feel I can talk about without ruining the story for you. It has all the elements of your traditional plot-driven thriller. It is less of a whodunit and more of a whydunit. I mean, the disaster is long in the past, the perpetrator languishing in jail, awaiting execution, the son simply trying to make sense of it all. And while it had all those elements that are familiar to thriller stories, this still felt uniquely Korean. And maybe it has something to do with the fact that I've read a bunch of Korean works in translation in quick succession, one after the other, but something has really struck me after that. And I'm just spitballing here, so hear me out. I was raised, and my generation was raised in the West, with this notion of the happy ending, the hero riding off into the sunset, the happily ever after, the band of plucky rebels defeating the massive evil empire. And movies focus group to death so that audiences leave the theater feeling happy, content. All the loose ends tied up, a little bow put on top of all the challenges introduced in the first half of the movie. Our TV shows growing up were an unending succession of self-contained episodes where no problem was too great that couldn't be resolved in the appointed hour minus commercial breaks. There is a return to order in the universe, a return to optimism and the way things should be. And of course, this was driven by the need for future syndication. These sort of episodes allowed to be shown in any order at all without breaking the flow. But that also meant hours and hours of television where everything was neatly tied up at the end. And I know with the death of cable, we're seeing changes to that narrative structure, longer story arcs, the birth of the anti-hero, but even there, we're seeing this need for some sort of resolution, landing at some specific point. And I think that carries over off in our fiction as well. I mean, it is the climax and the eventual denouement, picking up the pieces after the epic clash, the return home, the lessons learned, and then the fade to black. Korea seems more invested in the emotional turmoil the journey brings as opposed to worrying about sticking the landing. And maybe this is just the manifestation of Korean Han, the feeling of exhaustion, misery, shame, guilt, anger, and just piling these on as the story progresses until it comes to an end. Not with a bang, but a whimper, with this sense of resignation and understanding that life is hard and one needs resolve to keep making it through the days. It ends with understanding and not necessarily optimism. I mean, Kim Ji-young, born 1982, that I talked about in my last video, ends on such an invalidating note. Then there's bad friends, blood sisters, the law of lines, all refusing to come even close to something that resembles neat and tidy. And I know that this simply may be a trend in the books that get chosen to be made into English translations, or maybe this is just an isolated instance of the books I happen to be reading this year in translation. And I know this was prompted all by this book, but I don't want to say what side 7 Years of Darkness falls on as far as this trend goes. And to top it off, I've started watching K-dramas, or more specifically, I've watched 2 episodes of the Netflix series Itaewon Class. This came about when I was looking for recommendations, and fellow booktuber Robert over at Barter Hordes suggested this was the perfect show to start off with in K-drama. And that same day I was listening to a podcast, and Margaret Cho mentioned Itaewon Class as one of her favorites. And man, just that first episode was an emotional roller coaster. I think they take a special glee on heaping misery on the character and then leaving it on a cliffhanger. And I don't watch soap operas, so maybe this is just all common currency for the genre. But after watching this K-drama, reading these Korean works in translation, I'm just convinced Koreans are so extra. We just seem obsessed with the idea of how hard everything is. I know maybe this isn't exactly the best of hand cells in this particular time. Sitting with a lack of resolution and uncertainty isn't what we're looking for in our pandemic reads right now, and I get it. Maybe now more than ever we need those fairy tale endings, the sense of progress, the world bending to justice. But at the same time, maybe we shouldn't always be opting for the easy way out, and maybe sit with the fact that there's a lot of hard work, toil, and struggle in getting through the day-to-day. And I know this is way off in the weeds. This isn't the heavy lifting that 7 Years of Darkness is doing. This is a plot-driven thriller that I did enjoy. A huge hit in South Korea. It sold 500,000 copies. It's been turned into a play. It's already been turned into a movie called 7 Years of Night. So yes, check it out, enjoy it, and maybe not be riddled with all this existential anguish doing it. Okay, book giveaway time. This is yet again another chance to win one of 12 possible Korean works in translation released here in 2020. If you need a list of all 12, you can check out my Instagram. So this is also a separate draw from the last video. So if you entered then, you can enter again. All of these will be selected at the end of the month of October. And I'm going to try and make sure that no one wins twice. This time out, all you need to do is tell me which of the books that you want to receive, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and answer this question. What was the last piece of Korean culture that you consumed? Whether it was bibimbap, BTS, the movie Parasite, a work in translation, Kim's Convenience, let me know in the comments down below, and we'll enter you in the draw to win a book anywhere in the world that Amazon or Book Depository ships to. So, get busy. In the meantime, I hope you all have a great week of reading, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.